The money Vladimir Putin uses to fund his brutal invasion of Ukraine doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's earned via Russia's oil sales. Putin knows this, which is why he's built a shadow fleet to circumvent Western sanctions and is desperately selling oil at below-market prices to countries like China and India to keep his war going. Now, the US has had enough of India helping to fund Putin's war. India's Russian oil gamble has backfired spectacularly as the US is set to punish it for providing Putin with a vital economic lifeline. The news broke on August 6th, when the BBC reported that US President Donald Trump had issued a new executive order that would see the US hit India with a new 25% tariff. That alone would be bad enough. However, the US already has a 25% tariff in place against India, meaning this order will raise the tariff to 50%. That's among the highest the US has imposed so far, and it's being pushed onto a supposed ally. There are a couple of caveats to this order. Trump has said he'll implement a 3-week delay to give India a chance to do what it needs to do. As for what Trump wants, it's very simple. India needs to stop buying Russian oil. If it doesn't, he says, the new tariff goes into effect on August 27th and threatens to send shockwaves through the Indian economy. It all comes down to India's Russian oil purchases. The tariff announcement didn't come entirely out of left field, as Trump had warned just a couple of days before that he would raise levies if India kept buying Putin's oil. On August 6th, the White House also released a statement explaining why the US views these oil purchases as such a major problem. Russian Federation's actions in Ukraine pose an ongoing threat to US national security and foreign policy, necessitating stronger measures to address the national emergency, the White House said. Trump has added to this, stating that India doesn't seem to be at all bothered by the implications of its Russian oil purchases on the Ukrainian people. In a statement on his Truth Social platform, Trump declared, "India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, they are then, for much of the oil purchased, selling it on the open market for big profits. They don't care how many people in Ukraine are being killed by the Russian war machine. Because of this, I will be substantially raising the tariff paid by India to the USA." And Trump may have a point. India is pumping billions of dollars into the Russian economy with its oil purchases. That's according to The Independent, which reports that Reuters recently discovered that India is the world's biggest buyer of Russia's seaborne crude oil. About 1.75 million barrels of that oil have arrived at Indian ports per day between January and June 2025, which is a 1% increase over the same period last year, and is high enough to have pumped a staggering $50 billion into the Russian economy for the financial year ending March 2025. India will argue that it needs this oil. It's a country of over 1.4 billion people, and it has a limited capacity to produce oil on its own. Those people need to have their energy requirements met, which has led to India becoming the third largest importer of oil in the world. Russia accounts for 35% of the crude oil that India buys, and Putin has been able to rely on India to keep his coffers full from the moment he invaded Ukraine. In 2022 alone, India was buying around 2 million barrels of crude oil from Russia daily, becoming Putin's biggest buyer in the process. And though the numbers seem to have dropped since, that's more because India used the sanctions placed on Russia to build a stockpile of cheap Russian crude than it is due to any effort by India to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine. The point of Trump's tariff is simple. Putin relies on oil sales to fund his invasion, and India is a major customer. Take that customer away by threatening tariffs, and Putin will suddenly find himself scrambling to fill a multi-billion-dollar gap in Russia's revenue. Honing back in on Trump's proposed tariff, it doesn't appear as though it will affect every Indian industry. The BBC says that pharmaceuticals and electronics will be exempt from the tariffs, which is big news because US consumers won't want to see the cost of either of these types of goods rise than they already are. However, affected industries will include the likes of auto parts, textiles, seafood, and the gems and jewelry sector. It's unclear just how much of India's trade with the US these new measures will affect. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, India exported $87.3 billion of goods to the US in 2024, which was a 4.5% increase over the previous year. The figures aren't broken down any further, but we can safely assume that the tariff-free electronics and pharma industries made up a large amount of that export volume. Of the tariffed industries we've already mentioned, the textile sector perhaps gives us the best sense of how widespread an impact Trump's punishment will have on the Indian economy. In 2023, India was the world's 6th largest exporter of textiles, selling $37.5 billion worth of these products, according to the Observatory of Economic Complexity. Of that $37.5 billion in sales, $9.71 billion of India's textiles were sold to the United States. So with textiles alone, there's a possibility that the new 50% tariff will impact a $10 billion industry. Add many billions more on top for the other affected industries and you get a potential economic shockwave brewing in India. A shockwave that India is far from happy about. The country's Ministry of External Affairs, or MEA, has already issued a response to Trump's tariff threat that is measured while suggesting that India has no intention, at least right now, of pulling back on its Russian oil purchases. The United States has in recent days targeted India's oil imports from Russia. The Indian Express reports the response as stating, "We have already made clear our position on these issues, including the fact that our imports are based on market factors and done with the overall objective of ensuring the energy security of 1.4 billion people of India." Immediately we see India's counter-argument to Trump's threat. It's all well and good for the US to tell India that it can't buy Russian oil, but with 1.4 billion people to serve, India will argue that it has a duty to those people to secure oil for as cheap a price as possible to ensure the energy security of a country that has a population that is around 4 times higher than that of the US. The statement continues, "It's therefore extremely unfortunate that the US chose to impose additional tariffs on India for actions that several other countries are also taking in their own national interest." Again, India may have a point. It's often easy to focus on the major players when it comes to the nations that are buying Russian oil. Alongside India, both China and Turkey are pumping billions of dollars into the Russian economy thanks to their purchases of oil. The Independent points out that China has bought $158.7 billion of Russian oil between January 2023 and July 2024, with Turkey spending $62.1 billion. However, these major players aren't the only countries suckling at Russia's fossil fuel teat. Despite the raft of sanctions imposed against Russian oil by the West, the likes of Slovakia, South Korea, Japan, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates all fund Putin's war machine through their oil purchases, says Energy Now. Oh, and the West is far from innocent. Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Poland, France, and many other European countries are still buying Russian oil, meaning India could argue that there is a tinge of hypocrisy to Trump's latest executive order. After all, as the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air reported in July, the European Union, or EU, was responsible for 6% of Russia's oil sales. That's the same amount as Turkey, which means we can assume that Russia has been pulling in similar levels of revenue from the EU as it has been from Turkey in recent years. Why should those EU countries, many of which are subjecting Russia to sanctions, avoid tariffs while India gets punished? That's a question that India isn't afraid to ask of the US, as revealed by the MEA's statement. The MEA caps off its response with a pair of clear messages to Trump and the US. "We reiterate that these actions are unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable," the MEA says. "India will take all actions necessary to protect its national interests." We'll dig into what all actions necessary may mean in a moment. For now, there are 2 ways to read this statement. The first is likely the way that the MEA intended it to be read. It wants the US to know that India won't be cowed by Trump's tariff threats, and demonstrated by pointing to the perceived unfairness and hypocrisy of the situation. India has too many people to supply with oil, and India wants the US to know that it won't be threatened. However, there is a second way to read this statement. It could all be a big bluff. The MEA may be talking tough in an attempt to get Trump to reconsider because it knows that the tariffs going through threaten to have a massive impact on the country. Right now, India is happy where it is. As DW points out, the country has spent a long time sitting on the fence and refusing to prioritize any of the nations with which it does business. To India, the US, Russia, and China all stand on equal footing, with this semi-neutrality also being part of the justification for why India is buying so much Russian oil in the first place. The US has a problem with Russia. That doesn't mean India has to share that problem. We also can't ignore the fact that India is one of the founding members of the BRICS economic bloc alongside Russia. India's relationship with that group hasn't always been perfect. Even as we speak, India is wary about other power players in BRICS attempting to expand their influence over the group by welcoming new members. Still, BRICS allows India to maintain economic ties with Russia, which likely bleed over into other aspects of the relationship between the 2 countries. Trump's new tariffs could threaten that relationship, forcing India into the exact position it's never wanted to occupy, being forced to pick a side. Perhaps that's what Trump is really angling for with his threat of tariffs against India. For too long, the US may feel India has sat on the sidelines during the Ukraine war. By doing so, it's been able to benefit from strong trade relationships with both the US and Russia. While the focus is on how India's oil purchases are helping to fund Putin's war machine, there may be a hidden agenda behind the new tariffs. If the US can get India firmly on its side by forcing it to stop buying Russian oil, that loss of a country that is at least something of an ally would sting Putin as much as the lost revenue. Of course, that assumes that India will be willing to jump off the fence and into the US yard without any resentment. That seems unlikely, given that it would be a tariff threat that forces the decision, which brings us nicely back to the all actions necessary comment we touched on earlier. What does that mean exactly? For now, we can't say for certain. Despite the MEA's fiery response, there are some inside India who are encouraging the country's leaders to stay calm and see how all of this plays out. One of them is Ajay Srivastava. A former Indian trade official, Srivastavar, says India should remain calm, avoid retaliation for at least 6 months, and recognize that meaningful trade negotiations with the US cannot proceed under threats or mistrust. The implication here is that India shouldn't rush into making any changes to its policy of buying Russian oil just yet, but it should also not immediately stand against the US. Wait and see, and it's possible that Trump's often turbulent policymaking could turn back around. While that's possible, it doesn't seem likely. India has 2 real choices for all actions necessary in the wake of Trump's tariff threat: stop buying Russian oil or end a decades-long friendship with the US. If India chooses the former, it's not without options when it comes to replacing the flow of Russian oil in the country. Remember that serving 1.4 billion people's energy needs is a chief concern for India, but that is doable with alternative suppliers. The Economic Times points out that India could turn to other suppliers in Africa and the Middle East to fill the gap. Iraq, from which India already buys oil, is an option. So too are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Again, these countries are already supplying India with refined oil products under a deal that the Economic Times says gives India the flexibility to increase how much of it buys as and when needed. In total, India is already buying oil from about 40 countries, including Russia. Canada, Brazil, and Guyana are soon to be added to that supplier list, so it's not like India has no options. However, none of those suppliers offer what Russia offers in terms of discounted prices on oil. Dargans.com notes that other suppliers won't be able to fill the gap left by Russia's oil quickly, and they certainly won't offer their product for the same cut price as Putin. India could make the switch away from Russia, but it will be taking an economic hit to do so. That hit will be factored into India's decision. Which has the worst economic impact? Trump's sanctions or paying more for non-Russian oil? The answer to that question will likely have a massive bearing on the choice India ends up making. And it's certainly possible that India could choose to go the other way. It might thumb its nose at the US and lean even harder into buying Russian oil. India's wariness about Trump's policymaking could be a determining factor here, as the Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies India program head Richard Rossow explains to The Independent. India's continued energy and defense purchases from Russia present a larger challenge, where India does not feel it can predict how the Trump administration will approach Russia from month to month, Rossow says. It's a point we touched on earlier. India may feel that it can take the wait-and-see approach because there's a chance that the US may flip-flop on its current Ukraine war position, as it seemingly has several times since Trump became president. Assuming that flip-flop doesn't come, India continuing to buy Russian oil, inspiring more threats from Trump in the process, has the potential to end a prosperous relationship that has taken over 2 decades to build. On August 6th, the BBC noted that Trump's relationship with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has hit rock bottom amidst all of this tariff talk. That's a flip-flop in its own right. Modi was one of the first world leaders to visit Trump following his election win, and the two have described each other as friends in the past. Now Trump is calling the Indian economy dead and is making grandiose claims about having brokered a ceasefire between India and Pakistan that neither country seems willing to admit that Trump had any part in. Tensions are rising. India, continuing to buy Russian oil, could lead to those tensions simmering over. The Carnegie Endowment says that Trump may be on the verge of destroying a valuable relationship. After more than 2 decades of bipartisan effort to transform the relationship between New Delhi and Washington, including during his own first term, US President Donald Trump is now in the process of dismantling this painstakingly built relationship, it says. That process isn't irreversible, but if India decides that it's not going to play Trump's games, the new US approach may do nothing more than lead India deeper into the arms of Putin. Russia's leader would love that outcome. But again, we can only wait and see. Speaking of Putin, it's important to consider what Trump's tariff threat would mean for Russia if India decides to stop buying Russian oil. Money would be the big problem for Putin. He would still have a good chunk of cash coming in from Russia's oil sales if he lost India as a customer. China and Turkey, as we mentioned earlier, are still spending billions of dollars on Russian crude. And since the start of Putin's Ukraine invasion up to May 29, 2025, he's made $973 billion from selling fossil fuels, a staggering $266 billion of which has come from the countries that are actively sanctioning him. So the oil money won't dry up entirely, but losing India would strike a massive blow at a time when Russia needs all of the money it can get to fund Putin's ill-fated war. As Business Insider reported on August 6th, Russia's oil and gas revenues fell by 27% in July 2025 compared to 2024. That gives us a hint that Russian oil is already in trouble. That decline in revenue contributed to Russia posting a deficit of 1.7% of its gross domestic product for the first half of 2025, again suggesting that even the oil money Russia is generating with India as a buyer isn't enough to continue funding Putin's war. The Kyiv Post also points out that Russia would lose 38% of its oil export revenue if India backs away. It spoke to Hope for Ukraine's CEO, Yuri Boyachko, who said, "Russia is spending nearly $1 billion per day on its war in Ukraine," he said. "If President Trump can pressure India to stop buying Russian oil, Putin could run out of money to fund the war very quickly, since oil exports are Russia's primary source of revenue. Who knows? Trump's tariff threat against India could be the key to ending the war." We say could be because it's likely that Trump isn't necessarily looking for India to stop buying Russian oil altogether. His real goal may be the goal that he has in almost every interaction with another country, striking a deal. The Kyiv Independent says that the US is currently looking to achieve greater market access inside India for American dairy and agricultural farmers, while India has opposed this, preferring to keep both sectors domestic to protect its own agricultural industry. That desire for access could be a bargaining chip used by both sides in negotiations over Trump's tariffs. Remember that India has until August 27th to find a way out of this mess. It could offer access in return for the US allowing it to continue buying Russian oil, even if it's at a lower volume than right now. By the same token, the US could make that very offer to India. You get to keep your Russian oil if you start buying US dairy and farm products. This idea of making a deal is also mentioned by Business Insider. It doesn't mention the agricultural angle specifically, but it does point out that India may agree to scrap its Russian oil purchases in return for certain concessions from the US. Could that mean a demand to drop the 25% tariff that's already in place? Maybe it could mean that India tells Trump it wants the US to buy more Indian products to make up for India having to spend more money on other countries' oil. We can't know for sure. But with 21 days to go until Trump's new tariffs come into effect, you can guarantee there will be a lot of discussion between the US and India in the coming days. And it's not just India that's having to deal with Trump's wrath. The US president has had enough of Russia, and he's moved nuclear submarines into strike positions. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of America's latest efforts to bring an end to the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.